Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Hello and welcome. Today I want to tell you the entire story of the Druids. The reason is simple. They are one of those groups of the ancient world that seem both real and somehow unreal at the same time. Upon hearing the word Druid, you instantly imagine forests, rituals, secret knowledge, and people who, it seems, understood nature in a way that we all have long forgotten. The Druids stand at a wonderful crossroads between history and enchantment. I will lead you through where they lived, what they, according to legend, did, why they were so important to Celtic society, and how their legend continued to grow even after their world began to change. If you like stories like this, please give a like and subscribe. It is the best way to support the channel, and it helps these long journeys find the people who need them. And if you wish, write from which part of the world you are listening to us. Thank you for being here. And now settle in comfortably. This will be a fascinating journey. A funny thing happens with Druids as soon as you start looking for them. They are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. You can walk into any bookstore and find them in the fantasy sections, on shelves with spiritual literature, in glossy books about ancient secrets, and in those tourist shops where they will sell you a pouch of mist and promise that it is real Irish folk. But the real Druids, those who lived and breathed in the old Celtic world, left us no personal diaries, no clear lists of rules, no glamorous handbooks on this is how we do it. Therefore, we stand at the edge of their world like a person stands at the edge of a forest at night. We hear movement inside, but we never quite see who made the sound. To understand how they were able to become so powerful in legends, while remaining so elusive in details, one must enter the Celtic world itself, because the Druids did not float above society like a mysterious smoke. They were woven into it. The Celts were not a single empire marching under one flag. It was a large family of tribes scattered across a vast part of Europe. They lived in Britain and Ireland, throughout Gaul, in parts of Spain and Central Europe, and even as far east as Anatolia, where the Galatians settled, causing enough trouble to be remembered by name. This was a world of hill forts, long trade routes, shifting alliances, and a rich culture of art, metalwork, song, and law. It was a world in which courage, reputation, hospitality, and a poetic memory were valued, capable of sustaining the life of generations simply by pronouncing their names. If you are trying to imagine this atmosphere, visualize a society where the past is not a dusty shelf, but an active presence that can be summoned by the right words at the right time. In such a setting, an educated class was not a luxury, but a pillar. Someone had to remember the laws, maintain peace between clans, preserve sacred traditions, and explain the meaning of the sky, the seasons, the storms, sudden deaths, and unexpected good fortune that could appear as a gift or a warning. The Druids perfectly met this need, and their role seems almost inevitable when you clearly imagine that world. They were not only religious figures, but also teachers, judges, advisors to kings, and guardians of traditions. Their authority did not come from castles or armies. It came from knowledge and the belief that knowledge itself is a form of power. When a society recognizes that certain people have access to the rules of the universe, something stronger than fear arises. Trust arises. Reverence arises. A feeling arises that it is the Druids who keep the invisible mechanism of life in working order. The name itself sounds as if it carries the scent of foliage after rain. Many associate the word Druid with the oak, and this image is so compelling that it is hard not to love it. The oak was one of the great kings of the forest in Celtic perceptions. It was strong, durable, and generous with shade and shelter. It was also a practical tree for a world that built, heated, cooked, and crafted from wood. But the oak also possessed that symbolic weight that turns a tree into an idea. A person who knew the oak understood the grove, could speak of the forest as a place of meanings rather than just resources. Seemed like a person who understood life itself. When later sources describe Druids gathering in groves or venerating certain trees as sacred, it does not seem like a decorative detail. It seems like a key clue to how they saw the world, the problem or the delight. Depending on the mood is that almost everything we hear about them comes from outsiders. Greek and Roman writers looked at the Druids with admiration, curiosity, and sometimes with alarm. Julius Caesar is the most famous of these voices because he was not just a casual observer. He was a man trying to conquer the world to which the Druids belonged. When he wrote about them during his campaigns in Gaul in the 1st century BC, he described an organized and influential priestly class. He informs us that they managed sacrifices and religious matters, took an active part in courts and disputes, and 4 years educated young men. He also claims that they believed in the immortality of the soul and its migration from body to body, a belief that would have been both comforting and motivating in a warrior culture. Imagine how useful such a belief can be when you ask someone to stand face to face with a Roman legion without flinching. Caesar also says something that for centuries stirred the imagination. He suggests that Britain was the main center of Druidic learning, and that those who wanted to receive the deepest training traveled there. Whether it is literal truth or a Roman impression of British prestige, it adds a wonderful sense of scale. It implies a network of learning across the sea. It suggests that Druidic education might have been something like attending a famous school, where staying in the right place could determine your status for life. If you let this image come alive for a moment, you can see a young student leaving home, crossing stormy waters and arriving in a land of forests and ancient sanctuaries, eager to study the rules of the sacred world, just as others study the rules of politics or war. And the education itself is one of the most impressive ideas in the whole story. The Druids, like the bards, lived in a culture where memory was a craft. They fundamentally did not trust their teachings to writing, and not because they did not know how to write. Writing existed everywhere around them, but because oral knowledge possessed a special authority. When something is learned and passed from teacher to student, it comes alive in the act of speech. It becomes part of the person who possesses it, and it becomes harder for a casual stranger to steal it. Roman sources suggest that the training of Druids could take many years, even up to 20. This is a long time to sit with elders, learn poems and laws, absorb genealogies, mythical tales, sacred formulas, observations of the stars, and an extensive catalogue of plants and their applications. This time is also sufficient to turn learning into identity. You are not just someone who knows a fact, you become someone who belongs to a lineage of knowledge. It also helps explain why Druids could occupy a place that was both spiritual and political. In societies without a centralized bureaucracy, people who control knowledge control the social glue that holds everything together. A Druid capable of resolving a blood feud, interpreting a bad omen, or confirming the legitimacy of a king was not a secondary character. He was a key mechanism of order. When Roman writers mention that Druids could impose severe religious penalties, including exclusion from rituals, it sounds like a spiritual punishment, but it was also a social punishment, in a culture where the community and ritual were inextricably linked. To be cut off meant an almost total erasure of the personality. If you are looking for soft power in the ancient world, this is it, but it would be a mistake to imagine them only as stern judges and solemn priests. The Celtic world adored stories, poetry, and reputation, and Druids would move in this world as highly educated figures, understanding how to speak so that words had weight. Their authority likely was accompanied by performance, ceremony, and the careful use of language. In a society where words could have binding force, where satire could destroy a person's standing, and praise poetry could elevate a leader to an almost mythical status, people who mastered language possessed special influence. A Druid could feel just as confident at a public assembly as in a quiet grove, because both places required the same skill, the ability to read the situation, read the signs, read the story of who the people consider themselves to be. There exists a more massive question that looms over all of this, the one that makes the Druids so attractive. Where is their beginning? The earliest written mentions of Druids from the Mediterranean world show us that by the time the Greeks and Romans noticed them, they were already an established and respected class. This suggests a long development behind the scenes. Druidism likely grew out of older Indo-European religious models and local Celtic traditions shaped by centuries of social change. Druids could have inherited practices from even earlier sacred specialists, and then formed them into a formal class. By the time the Iron Age was in full swing, the Celts were building not only fortresses and trading goods, they were building ideas about identity, ancestors, and the relationship between humanity and the living world. Druids would be at the center of that, not as inventors of religion from scratch, but as professional guardians of a worldview that was already deeply rooted. This is where the mythical glow begins to form, because when you have a class of people who do not write down their secrets, who train for years in memorized wisdom, who link law, ritual, and cosmology into one role, and who meet in places appearing separated from ordinary life, you get a natural aura. The sacred grove is not just a location, it is a symbol of a different way of thinking. It is the idea that knowledge can be rooted in nature, that the forest itself can be a classroom, and that the gods might prefer foliage and sky over stone temples. Whether the Druids were literally always in the forest is less important than the idea that they belonged to the forest, that their authority was not separated from the natural world, but issued from it. If you imagine a day in that early Druidic world, you can almost see how they fit into the rhythm of life. A leader could consult with them before concluding an important alliance. A farmer could seek their blessing for an important planting. A family could ask for advice after a troubling dream. A young student could observe an elder reciting a genealogy going back so far that old dead ancestors begin to seem present and attentive. And in moments of large public ceremonies, when the tribe gathered to mark a change of season or a sacred duty, the Druids gave the event its form and meaning. They were those people who told you why it was important and why the gods might be listening. And then, of course, the moment arrives when the outside world begins to close in. The Romans were not just passing tourists with notebooks. They were the most organized imperial power the Western world had ever seen. When Rome met the Celtic world, it encountered not only fierce warriors and impressive hill forts, but also a spiritual class that could unify people through shared faith and law. It is easy to understand why Roman writers paid them such close attention. The Druids were not a quaint local custom. They were a system of influence. The fact that Caesar took the time to describe their role speaks to his understanding that they were part of what made Celtic society resilient and coherent. So, in this first stretch of history, before any great clashes with the empire or the dramatic end of old traditions, we see the Druids in their natural element. They had not yet become a memory. They were an active force. They belonged to a world where myth was not a category of entertainment, but a way of explaining reality, where the line between nature and sacred meaning was thin enough to step across, where the education of a single individual could take decades, because that education was meant to shape the entire community. The Druids make more sense if we think of them not as isolated mystics, but as the mind and conscience of a society that believed knowledge must be carried by human beings, spoken by human voices, and protected by tradition. When you stand at the edge of this world, you feel why their legend has proven so durable. People love the very idea that there once existed teachers who learned in forests, carried laws in their minds, could speak of the soul without fear of death, and treated the living earth as a sacred partner rather than a silent resource. Whether you encounter them in Roman chronicles, in later Celtic tales, or in the modern imagination, the emotional message is always the same. The Druids embody a sort of lost confidence in the meaning of existence, the comforting thought that the world was readable, that signs could be understood, and that wisdom held a central place in public life. And as the light fades, transitioning to the next part of their journey, my favorite image is very simple. Imagine a grove at the end of a long day. The air cools, conversations quiet down. A teacher and a student linger after everyone else has gone, repeating lines of laws or verses until the words settle in the memory. Somewhere beyond the trees, the tribe eats, argues, celebrates, and prepares for the next season. The Druids are present in all of this, not loud, not flashy, but indispensable. The forest gradually sinks into darkness, while ancient knowledge continues to stay awake within the human mind. If the first thing that makes the Druids so magnetic is the fog of mystery surrounding them, the second is the true scale of what they tried to achieve. They were not just people performing rituals and speaking to gods in forests. They were people who carried within themselves the memory of an entire society. And that is a much more serious job than it seems. In a world without printing presses, without public libraries, without simple ways to store information outside the fragile human mind, specialists were required who could act as living archives. The Druids, apparently, were precisely such people. When Roman authors describe them, a tone of simple curiosity is rarely heard. It is more like the report of a person who has stumbled upon a carefully constructed system, operating at an impressive speed. Therefore, to understand them humanly, it is useful to imagine not a mysterious sorcerer, but an elite educator, a judge, a philosopher, and a cultural anchor who simply performed his most vital work under the canopy of trees, rather than under marble columns. The training alone commands respect. Ancient sources claim that becoming a Druid required a long period of study, sometimes up to 20 years. Even if we take this number as an approximation intended to impress the reader, the essence remains clear. These were not weekend courses. It was a way of life. A young person embarking on the path of Druidic training was essentially choosing to belong to a specialized class, with responsibilities touching upon religion, law, folklore, diplomacy, and social cohesion. The very thought that you spend the majority of your youth studying sacred formulas, tribal law, genealogies, rituals, astronomy, poetry, and the medicinal properties of plants suggests that the Druids were not engaged in improvisation. They were not accidental mystics who woke up one day and decided to earn a living by divining from clouds. They were part of a structured system of knowledge with its own standards, expectations, and a clear social purpose. And another beautiful detail: they preferred to teach orally. One should not think that the Celts did not know how to write. Literacy existed throughout the ancient world, and the Celts were in contact with literate cultures through trade and war. But the oral tradition was a matter of values, not ability. When knowledge is written down, it becomes a thing that can be carried away. When knowledge is passed from memory to memory, it becomes a relationship. It binds the student to the teacher, and the teacher to a lineage of tradition stretching back through the centuries. This also makes learning an act of endurance and devotion. You prove you are worthy of the knowledge by the effort you make to hold it within yourself. In this sense, the refusal to record sacred teachings was not stubbornness. It was a form of protection and a way to make wisdom feel alive. Imagine a young student, perhaps a child of a noble family, arriving where learning happens under the open sky. We have no schedule or curriculum in the modern sense, so we have to guess the form of the lessons from the records of foreigners, and from the logic of the society itself. But it is easy to imagine a routine combining the practical and the sacred. Morning lessons might be dedicated to law. Elders recite rulings and precedents, cases of land disputes, blood feuds, compensation, and obligations between clans. In a culture where honor and justice were deeply public matters, knowledge of the law was not a quiet academic skill. It was a way to keep entire communities from self-destructs. Later in the day, training might shift to poetry and memory. The student learns how to recite the lineages of kings and heroes, how to preserve the names of the dead, how to speak so that words carry weight at public assemblies. And in all of this, the sacred world is always present, not as a separate subject, but woven into every detail. The gods, the spirits of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, The meaning of animals and natural signs, these are not additions. They are the very foundation. The Druids were not the only educated class in the Celtic world, and this detail makes them even more real. Bards and poets performed a parallel function, preserving stories and reputations. In many ways, Druids and bards were cousins in one cultural family, each specializing in different forms of authority. A bard could elevate a leader to the level of myth, or turn his reputation to ash with satire. A Druid could confirm the legitimacy of a king, resolve disputes, and bring the life of the tribe into alignment with the sacred order of the universe. In a society where memory was currency, these roles overlapped and reinforced each other. Together, they formed a kind of cultural nervous system. If you remove them, the body of society remains, but it loses the ability to coordinate itself with its former grace. Roman authors mention that Druids were often exempt from military service and taxes. This sounds like a privilege, and it was, but it also points to something deeper. In a warrior society, exemption is not given lightly. It implies that the Druids were considered too important to perish in battle, or be distracted by worldly affairs. Their value lay in what they knew and what they could do for the spiritual and legal health of the community. This also hints at how their neutrality was maintained. A judge who must resolve disputes between clans cannot easily belong to one of the war bands. A spiritual authority regulating rituals needs the trust of the entire tribe, not just the faction with the sharpest swords. Their public role as judges deserves special attention, as it is here that we see them most clearly in everyday life. When two families argued over a boundary, or when a killing demanded compensation or revenge, the Druids could step in as those who knew the correct forms, the correct precedents, the correct balance between justice and peace. Caesar tells us that they judged almost all public and private disputes. This is a massive statement, and perhaps the reality varied from region to region, but it still paints an image of a class capable of regulating social tension. In a sense, the Druids were not merely guardians of religion, they were guardians of order. This leads us to one of the harshest punishments attributed to them. Exclusion from sacrifices and rituals was considered the most severe penalty. In modern terms, it is hard to imagine that a ban on attending ceremonies could be worse than a fine or imprisonment. But in an ancient community, where ritual was a key way of belonging, to be cut off meant moral and social isolation. It was akin to being excluded from the story your people tell about themselves. There is something strict and strangely elegant about a society that treats spiritual exclusion as the ultimate measure of punishment, because it shows how deeply religion and social identity were fused. The Druids also, apparently, were advisors to kings and chieftains. Here we can imagine a completely human dynamic. Power in the Celtic world was personalized. It rested on leaders who forged alliances, conducted raids, distributed gifts, and maintained honor. Those leaders needed advisors capable of speaking not only of politics, but of legitimacy, taboos, and the right time for making important decisions. When to begin a campaign, when to take an oath, who is truly worthy to lead the tribe. These are questions with practical consequences, but in a pagan society, they are also religious ones. A Druid confirming that a decision aligns with sacred law strengthens the ruler's authority in the eyes of everyone who believes the gods are attentive to the affairs of men. And, of course, there is the famous mention of belief in reincarnation or, at the very least, the immortality of the soul. Roman authors tell us that the Druids taught that the soul does not die but passes into another body. Again, we cannot know exactly how this was understood in every specific place and time, but this idea aligns with the general Celtic sense that the boundary between this world and the next was permeable. This belief also has obvious social consequences. If you expect life to continue in another form, the fear of death changes its shape. Courage becomes easier to cultivate. Loss is perceived differently, and the universe itself seems not like a straight line, but a cycle, which perfectly suits a religion so closely tied to the seasons and natural rhythms. When you delve into these details, the image of Druidic education becomes even more impressive. A student did not simply memorize facts, he absorbed a worldview that linked cosmic cycles, moral law, communal identity, and personal destiny into a single, coherent system. It is precisely this kind of training that generates a quiet confidence, and this may help explain why the Druids seemed so formidable to Roman observers. Rome was used to a priesthood, yes, but the Roman religious system was often more transactional and civic in its style. The Druids, by contrast, represented a more holistic role, the type of figure who could be a philosopher today, a legislator tomorrow, and a ritual leader the day after. The same person who interprets an omen can also resolve a land dispute and educate the next generation. This is an extraordinary concentration of authority. The question of place is also important. Druids are invariably associated with the natural environment. Groves, rivers, hills, and islands appear as sacred landscapes. Whether every lesson took place in the fresh air is not so important. What matters is that their identity was tied to the living world. The classroom was not a building, it was a relationship with nature. This makes their learning seem less like abstract theory and more like the ability to listen to the environment as a teacher, to know which plants heal and which bring harm, to understand which birds or animals are symbolically connected to specific deities, to track the changing seasons, to read the sky, to learn to recognize those quiet patterns that can guide a community in practical and spiritual ways. Consider even their medical knowledge alone. A druid who knew the properties of herbs could be a healer in times when illness could destroy the future of an entire family. The line between medicine and magic was not sharp. Gathering a plant at the right phase of the moon or with the recitation of the correct ritual words could be both a spiritual act and a practical one. These spheres were not separated. The belief that nature was enchanted was not a metaphor, it was a working assumption. In such a worldview, a healer is also a spiritual technician. A plant is simultaneously chemistry and a sacred gift. We might not describe it that way today, but for the Celts, it was perfectly logical. Here, the Druids begin to seem not only powerful but strangely familiar. Every society creates specialists who perform the work that holds the larger system together. We have judges, professors, doctors, historians, and religious leaders. The Druids, it seems, compressed many of those roles into a single institution. So, if you want to imagine what it was like to meet a Druid in daily life, you don't need to immediately plunge into fantasy. You can imagine the Druid as a person whom everyone respects, because he knows how everything should be done and why it matters. The one who can quote old agreements between clans. The one who remembers what happened 3 generations ago, when 2 families nearly went to war. The one who knows the history of a sacred river and the taboo that cannot be broken without inviting misfortune. This is not theatrical magic, it is social magic. The mystical aura, of course, is still here. And part of what makes the world of the Druids so compelling is that it is not ashamed of mystery. The Celts loved life, were ready for war, and were deeply poetic. They did not hold the supernatural at arm's length, they wove it into the fabric of ordinary life. Therefore, a Druid could walk through a settlement and be approached not only for legal matters, but for spiritual ones as well. A troubling dream, an encounter with a strange animal, a series of unusually harsh storms, a child born under a certain sign. The Druid was the one who could translate these events into meanings. In modern terms, we call this interpretation. In ancient times, it could be the difference between calm and panic. Part of this influence was also reinforced by ceremonies. We can easily imagine communal gatherings where the Druids presided over rituals tied to seasonal festivals. The turning points of the year were more than just agricultural markers. They were sacred thresholds. Bonfires lit at key moments, offerings made to ensure fertility and peace. These gatherings were simultaneously social glue and a religious affirmation. Leading them required confidence, knowledge, and the ability to project authority without relying on physical force. That is a rare skill in any era. It is worth remembering, too, that the Druids were part of a world that loved spectacle when it mattered. Celtic art and metalwork show a people with a taste for complex beauty and symbolic ornament. A ritual space might be simple in its materials but rich in meaning. The presence of elders reading sacred formulas or invoking the gods was enough to change the atmosphere of an entire crowd. Religion in such a setting is not a private matter, it is a communal theatre with real consequences. When Caesar describes Druidic training, he also emphasizes that students learned about the size of the earth, the movements of celestial bodies, and the nature of the cosmos. This is striking, as it suggests a curiosity that goes beyond immediate ritual needs. The Druids were not merely repeating inherited formulas. They thought, studied patterns, and made sense of the universe. In this sense, they belonged to the tradition of ancient philosophers as much as to that of priests. Their knowledge likely included observations of the sun and moon, necessary for maintaining a calendar, understanding when to plant and harvest, when to hold festivals, and when to expect certain seasonal shifts. This is the kind of practical astronomy that grounded spiritual authority in everyday benefits. At this point, it becomes easier to see why the Druids were described as an elite class rather than a marginal group. Society needed them. Their preparation created people who could help stabilize communities, form identity, ensure ritual continuity, and preserve knowledge in a world where memory was the most reliable storehouse. They were the human infrastructure of culture. When you compress so much responsibility into one institution, you also create a class whose removal would feel like ripping out the roots of a tree. There is a poignant side to this as well. Imagine the psychological weight of training for 20 years to hold the memory of your people, to memorize laws, stories, and genealogies so thoroughly that you become the living point of reference for others. This is a type of mental architecture that modern education rarely demands of us. It would require discipline, endurance, and a deep sense of purpose. It also implies that teachers were held in extraordinary respect. Knowledge cannot be transmitted on such a scale without a culture that honors learning. This is why the Druids resist simple stereotypes. They were not just forest mystics. They were not just priests. They were a class of professionals in a world where professionalism looked different, but functioned in recognizable ways. Their authority was spiritual, legal, educational, and cultural. Their classrooms were sacred spaces. Their exams were likely public performances and memorization. Their diplomas were reputation, trust, and the right to speak with the voice of tradition. And all of this took place in a tense and changing world. The Celtic tribes were not isolated. They traded with the Mediterranean. They fought among themselves and against expanding powers. They amassed wealth, minted coins, and developed complex social hierarchies. As this world became increasingly connected and experienced growing pressure from the rising power of Rome, it was the Druids who were tasked with explaining what the changes meant, what could be adopted, what must remain sacred, and how to preserve identity when the horizon continued to fill with unfamiliar banners. Therefore, when we imagine the Druids as teachers and guardians of wisdom, we should see them not as frozen in eternal mist, but as moving through a living society that was busy, proud, and anxious about the future. Just as all societies are, the Druids were the people who could say, "This is who we are, and this is how we remain a single whole." They offered a sense of continuity. They provided the tools for navigating conflicts. They linked the tribe to its ancestors and to the invisible world. The day ends again where it began, in a grove or a quiet hall where learning does not tolerate haste. A student repeats a line of law until it begins to slip easily from the tongue. An elder corrects the rhythm, the emphasis, the memory of who said what and why it was important. Somewhere nearby, an evening meal is being prepared. Livestock stir in their pens. A child laughs. A dog barks at a shadow. The sacred and the mundane do not compete, they coexist. The Druids' work is not to escape the world, but to keep it intelligible. And as twilight descends upon the trees, the great secret of their power seems surprisingly simple. They were important because they remembered. They were important because they taught. They were important because in a universe that could be chaotic and brutal, they offered a map of meanings that people could carry in their hearts. If the Druids were the mind and conscience of the Celtic world, then their religion was the air they breathed. This is the part of the story where facts and legends lean against each other, like two friends telling the same memory with different details. We know the Druids were religious specialists. We know they performed rites and taught doctrines. And we know they held power over sacred life, because this was repeated by the foreigners, who met them and sometimes feared them. But when we try to imagine what their spiritual world felt like from the inside, we must step into a landscape where nature was not a backdrop. It was a living partner in every important decision. In such a worldview, a grove is not just a group of trees, a river is not just water, the wind is not just weather, and an animal crossing your path is not just an animal. Everything can be a message. Everything can be a sign. Everything has a voice if you are trained to listen. The Druids were those who claimed to understand this language and could translate it for the rest of the community. There is a reason the image of Druids in the woods has such staying power, even if not every ceremony was conducted under the branches. This idea fits the logic of their religion. Many ancient religions built temples to house a deity. The Druids, apparently, recognized the divine in the world itself. Sacred groves are repeatedly mentioned in surviving reports. You can almost feel the social meaning of this choice. A temple built by humans says the gods need a house. A grove says the gods already live here. This is a subtle distinction with a massive emotional impact. Standing under old oaks, when the earth is damp and the air is full of the scent of leaves, it might be easier for you to believe that the world is permeated with spirit, that the boundary between human life and cosmic life is thin, and that ceremony does not need walls to be real. Druids, for all their scholarly authority, seem to have anchored their work in places that proved their points without a single argument. One of the most famous rituals associated with them is the gathering of mistletoe from an oak. The story has come down to us through Roman and later classical authors, who describe a ceremony in which Druids, often depicted in white robes, cut the mistletoe with a golden sickle, usually at a carefully chosen time in the lunar cycle. The plant was treated as a rare and powerful gift of the heavens that had chosen to grow upon the king of trees. Regardless of whether the details are exact, the symbolic meaning is unmistakable. Mistletoe is a plant that seems to appear from nowhere, suspended between sky and earth, rooted in a tree but not in the soil like other plants. It seems a natural riddle. For a religion that loved thresholds and liminal spaces, mistletoe would have been irresistible. It is easy to imagine a community watching this ceremony with the seriousness reserved for things that hold the health of the tribe in their invisible hands, believing that the right plant, gathered in the right way, could protect life, restore balance, and maintain the favor of the gods. Druids are also linked to animal lore in ways that speak to a broader Celtic fascination with the living world. Celtic art is full of stylized beasts, twisting forms, and creatures that seem to hint at symbolic meaning. Stories preserved later in Irish and Welsh traditions show a world where animals can be messengers, rivals, guides, or transformations of humans and gods. A boar could personify ferocity and noble danger. A stag could represent wild sovereignty and the pulse of the forest itself. Birds could carry prophecies. A raven might be a grim warning or a sign of divine attention. For people living close to the rhythms of hunting, herding, and seasonal migrations, animals were not abstract icons. They were daily facts of life, which made their symbolic power stronger, not weaker. A druid interpreting an animal sign was not inventing meaning out of thin air. He drew upon a shared sense that nature and fate were in dialogue. This is also the domain where druids blur into what we might call magic, though the word here may feel clumsy. For the Celts, healing, ritual, and spiritual authority were not separated into neat categories. A plant used to treat a fever might also be gathered with a prayer. An amulet could be both decorative and protective. A chant could be simultaneously poetry and spiritual technology. Druids, trained in memory and the laws of nature, were the ones who knew which roots soothed pain, which leaves treated infection, and which rituals helped bring the community into harmony with forces too great to be seen. This is one reason why Druids have survived in the imagination as masters of secret knowledge. Their knowledge was secret not because it was ostentatious, but because it was powerful in that quiet way that keeps people alive and reassures them that the world is not random. The calendar of the Celtic world adds another layer to this sacred logic. The great seasonal festivals that have come down to us, especially through Irish tradition, map out a year divided by sacred thresholds. Samhain marked the entry into the dark half of the year, a time when the boundaries between worlds were believed to grow thin. It was a festival of endings and beginnings, of fires, feasts, and the restless proximity of the other world. Beltane celebrated the flowering of life as spring turned towards summer. It was often associated with fire rituals and the blessing of livestock and the land. Imbolc, linked with the first stirrings of spring and later associated with Brigid in the Irish tradition, carried a sense of light returning in cautious increments. Lunasad, a harvest festival connected in later stories with the Godlo, honored the ripening world and the labor that made survival possible. These festivals are not merely charming cultural footnotes. They show a society that treated time itself as sacred and used ritual to turn the year into a meaningful story rather than a sequence of weather events. It is easy to imagine Druids at the center of these gatherings not as entertainers, but as those who understood the correct forms, the right prayers, the sacred timing, a society that believed the health of the harvest and the safety of the tribe, were influenced by divine grace, took these rites seriously. Druids set the tone for communal participation. They reminded people of the old stories that explained why Samhain mattered, why fire was a purifier and protector, and why uncertain night spirits and omens were more accessible. Even if most of the tribe understood the general meaning, it was the Druid who could articulate it in a way that made everyone feel the weight of tradition pressing kindly upon their shoulders. Druids also, apparently, taught ideas about the soul that gave their religion a philosophical depth that impressed Roman observers. The notion that the soul could survive death and perhaps transition into another form fits naturally into a worldview that sees life as cyclical. If the year dies in winter and returns in spring, if seeds disappear into the earth and rise again as green life, then the idea that human existence might follow an arc that does not break at death feels emotionally consistent. This belief did something subtle to the culture. It softened the terror of mortality and strengthened the sense that the tribe was part of a larger rhythm. It also gave Druids an even stronger claim to authority, as those who speak confidently about what happens after death inevitably become the ones people turn to for courage, consolation, and meaning. When outsiders like Caesar wrote about Druidic sacrifices, they emphasized that Druids presided over significant rituals, sometimes describing them in dramatic tones. The infamous image of the Wicker Man, filled with offerings or people and set ablaze, exists in classical records as part of the Roman attempt to explain the severity and power of Celtic religion. Whether one imagines this literally or symbolically, the essence within the cultural context is clear. The Romans believed that Druids were capable of mobilizing not only faith, but also armed fear, a religion requiring serious offerings to ensure the favor of the gods, suggests that the divine world was viewed as an active force in politics and war. It also shows why Rome later came to view Druids as more than just local priests. They were a spiritual authority, capable of unifying resistance and providing an ideological spine for tribal identity. But it would be unfair to reduce Druidic ritual only to the dramatic moments that so occupied Roman writers. Most religious life in any society is not a spectacle. It is repetition, blessing, daily observance of rites, small offerings, and the quiet comfort of doing what ancestors did before you. Druids likely oversaw rites of passage, the blessing of contracts, the sacred confirmation of marriages and alliances, and rituals describing the relationship between people and the land. when a community depends on the health of its fields and herds. A religion that ties prosperity to sacred order becomes a daily presence. A druid would have been a familiar figure, not an exotic one. A wise presence at a dispute, a counselor before a risky choice, a healer when illness troubled the home, an interpreter of strange dreams, unexpected storms, or troubling signs in animal behavior. In this sense, the Druidic religion was not a separate sphere, but rather the underlying grammar of life itself. It is here that mythology begins to rise from the ground like mist. Late Celtic stories, even those preserved in Christian-era manuscripts, still echo an older world where sacred specialists can shape fate through speech and ritual. Irish tales are full of geese sacred prohibitions and obligations that seem to be descendants of ancient spiritual law. Druids appear in these stories as advisors, prophets, and sometimes rivals to heroes. These are people who can bless a king or pronounce a judgment that becomes inevitable. Even when later storytellers write in a changed world, the memory of Druidic power remains intact. This suggests that, in the ancient imagination, the Druid was not simply a background priest. He was a figure capable of influencing the very narrative of life. Therefore, when we view Druids as nature's magicians, the most important thing to remember is that their magic was not an escape from reality. It was a way of organizing reality. A sacred grove is a legal and spiritual space. A seasonal festival is an agricultural and cosmic event. A ritual of healing is a medical and religious act. Druids lived at the intersection of these interests, and that intersection is exactly the place where a society puts the people it trusts most. This is also the reason why their legend is so durable. The modern imagination loves to divide the world into the rational and the mystical, science and spirit, fact and story. Druids belonged to a culture that did not require this split. They were simultaneously intellectual and mystical, practical and visionary, rooted in laws, trees, and the movement of the stars. As the sun sets lower on this part of the story, I like to imagine a gathering in late autumn. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. The fields are harvested, the crops are in storage. People bring their anxieties and hopes into a common space, warmed by the light of a bonfire. A druid stands not as a distant authority, but as a familiar pillar of the tribe, speaking the words that remind everyone that the year turns, as it always has. That darkness is part of a cycle, not the end of the story. That the other world may be close tonight, but that closeness is not only fear, it is also continuity. The ancestors are near. The gods are listening. The living world is inscribed in a great rhythm that the Druids have spent their lives learning to call by name. And beyond the circle of the fire and the voices, the forest has frozen in its quiet anticipation, full of old oaks and invisible paths, holding that silence that makes a person believe that the world has a memory of its own. You can feel the whole story shift the moment Rome enters it, because Rome did not just arrive with curious questions and a polite interest in local customs. Rome arrived with roads, rules, legions, and that very specific imperial confidence that says, "We are about to reorganize your entire world for your own good." The Druids had already been important for centuries. By the time Roman soldiers set foot in significant numbers on Celtic soil, they were teachers, judges, ritual leaders, guardians of memory, and the type of social authority that keeps a culture coherent when everything around it is diverse, tribal, and occasionally prepared to settle arguments with a spear. To the Romans, this was fascinating. To Roman generals who required obedience rather than philosophical conversation, this was also a problem. A people can be conquered with superior logistics and persistent violence. A worldview is harder to conquer. The Druids were not a single war band to be defeated. They were a system of belief and education that could outlast any single battle. And the Romans quickly realized, if you want to reshape Celtic society, you need to weaken the people who help it remember who it is. Early Roman writers who mention the Druids did so with a sense of encountering something ancient and impressive. By the time Julius Caesar was fighting in Gaul in the middle of the 1st century BCE, He was already dealing with a mature institution. His descriptions are the most famous because he wrote with the confidence of a commander who wanted Rome to see him as both a conqueror and a keen observer. He informs us that the Druids managed religious life and sacrifices and judged disputes. He says that young men flocked to them for education and that the training was long. He also notes their teaching on the immortality of the soul. It is impossible to read his account without sensing that he was impressed by how deeply rooted their authority was. Caesar was not sentimental. If he took the time to describe a social class, it meant that class was significant to the stability of the region he was trying to absorb. His reports suggest that the Druids were almost a parallel government, not in the bureaucratic Roman sense, but in the way they regulated moral order, settled conflicts, and provided a shared religious framework for tribes that might otherwise have had little reason to trust one another. Here, the political danger becomes clear. The Druids were the connective tissue of the Celtic world. To a Roman administrator, a class of tax-exempt spiritual intellectuals capable of rallying tribes through shared tradition and sacred authority might look like an obstacle to efficient rule. To a Roman general, they might look like the people who could turn resistance into a sacred duty. The Romans did not usually suppress local religions unless they saw them as a direct threat to imperial control. The fact that Druidism began to attract restrictive attention tells us that Rome viewed it as more than colorful folklore. The Druids were likely the kind of influence that could foster unity across tribal lines, especially in moments of external threat. When you have an invader speaking the language of empire and order, people speaking the language of ancestral law and sacred duty become natural leaders of resistance. The clash between Rome and the Druids was not a single event. It was a slow tightening of pressure, a series of campaigns and prohibitions, and a gradual shift in the balance of power. In Gaul, Caesar fought a complex war against a patchwork of tribes that alternated between alliance and rebellion. The Great Uprising, led by Vercingetorix in 52 BCE, became one of the most dramatic episodes of Celtic resistance. It is a story of fortified cities, desperate strategies, scorched earth tactics, and terrifying Roman persistence. The Druids are not central characters in Caesar's narrative of this rebellion, but the very form of the uprising suggests the cultural cohesion they helped maintain. The tribes of Gaul did not always get along. However, when the threat became existential, a broader sense of identity was born. The Druids, as guardians of shared traditions and sacred law, were part of the ideological backbone that helped this unity feel legitimate. Even if a Druid did not personally lead warriors into an attack, the belief structure they supported could turn resistance into something that felt not just political, but sacred. Roman accounts of Druidic sacrifices have always carried a grim fascination. The infamous story of the wicker figure, an enormous human-shaped idol filled with offerings and set ablaze, comes from classical sources intended to describe the severity and power of Celtic religious practice. The Romans were not above moralistic tales when it suited their needs, but it was these reports that shaped the understanding of Druidism for centuries. The image itself is frightening enough to persist through the ages, whether you perceive it as a literal practice, a symbolic exaggeration, or a Roman attempt to portray their enemies as both formidable and in need of civilizing conquest. In the history of the empire, it is important that the Romans believed the Druids were capable of commanding life and death in ritual form. That belief alone was enough to make them seem dangerous. An empire built on orderly law and controlled violence cannot tolerate a priesthood capable of justifying sacrifice through a different moral universe. Britain became the next great arena of confrontation. Caesar made expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, and although these were not full-scale conquests, they opened the mental map for Roman ambitions. Britain remained outside direct Roman rule until the invasion under Emperor Claudius in 43. By then, the Druids had already become part of the cultural identity the Romans expected to encounter. The Roman conquest of Britain unfolded over decades, and it was tied to cultural integration as much as military victories. Forts were built, roads were laid, Local elites were integrated into Roman systems, and Roman style of governance began to change daily life. Nevertheless, the Druids remained the symbolic and practical center of the old order. They were linked to sacred groves, to the authority of ancestral law, and to the idea that the spiritual world was anchored in the land itself, rather than in imperial temples. One of the most dramatic clashes occurred on the island of Mona, known today as Anglesey. Roman sources describe it as a stronghold of Druidic power in Britain, a place where the old religion had taken deep root. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a campaign against the island, earned 60 or 60 once. The descriptions we have are vivid and theatrical. They speak of Druids and their supporters gathered on the shore, shouting curses, raising their hands, and meeting the Roman advance with what must have looked like a dangerous mixture of spiritual confidence and political defiance. The Romans crossed, engaged in battle, and destroyed the sanctuaries. The sacred groves were burned. This attack was not just punitive, it was strategic. The goal was to destroy the spiritual infrastructure of resistance. It is hard not to imagine the emotional resonance of this event for the Celts who revered these places. The destruction of a grove was not just the loss of a meeting place. It was an attack on the living map of the sacred world. A grove holds memory. It is where elders taught students, where ritual confirmed community belonging, where the gods were honored in the presence of their own creation. To see such a place cut down or burned by outsiders was like watching the wounding of the ancient universe itself. The Romans were experts at turning symbolic violence into political results. By targeting sacred centers, they were proclaiming that Roman authority would henceforth stand above local spiritual sovereignty. The campaign against Anglesey has another dramatic nuance, as it was nearly simultaneous with the uprising led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. Her rebellion in 60 or 60 once was explosive and brutal. Roman cities were attacked, including Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, and the violence on both sides was devastating. In surviving texts, the Druids are not always directly linked to Boudica, but the timing itself makes this whole moment feel like a storm of resistance in which spiritual and political indignation blended in the same air. It is easy to imagine how a society rooted in sacred tradition might view the rebellion, not only as a political necessity, but as a cosmic correction. When the empire presses too hard, the gods may demand an answer. A Druidic worldview could provide the ideological fuel for such an uprising, one that demands more than just abstract freedom. It demands the restoration of sacred balance. After these conflicts, Roman policy hardened. Emperor Claudius is said to have banned Druidic practices in Gaul, especially those tied to sacrifice. This step is logical for the Roman legal imagination. You do not just defeat a rebellion on the battlefield, you also dismantle its cultural sources. If the Druids were exempt from taxes and military service, if they possessed intertribal authority, if they conducted rituals that reinforced a non-Roman identity, then controlling or removing them was an obvious step in strengthening imperial rule. Rome was pragmatic. It often tolerated local gods, reinterpreted them within Roman frameworks, and allowed regional customs to persist as long as they did not challenge imperial stability. Druidism, apparently, crossed the line from permitted difference to perceived threat. Nevertheless, even with the intensification of Roman pressure, cultural changes were not always a crude replacement of one with another. In many places, old Celtic gods and customs blended with Roman forms. Temples were built where groves once presided. Local deities were identified with Roman ones. The religious landscape became multi-layered. In such an environment, one can imagine Druids adapting to the situation, retreating to more private roles, or continuing their functions in altered forms. When a priesthood loses public power, it does not necessarily disappear overnight. It may move into the background, persisting through families, local rituals, and the slow, stubborn persistence of tradition. This part of history is full of human paradoxes. Romans could see in the Druids an obstacle to order. Local communities, most likely, saw in them the guardians of identity. Empires always skillfully convince themselves that they bring peace. Indigenous spiritual authorities always skillfully remember that such a peace can mean surrender. Between these two viewpoints lies the tangled truth of cultural contact. Some representatives of the local elite eagerly adopted Roman customs, as this brought wealth, stability, and status. Others resisted because the price was too high. The Druids, whose authority rested on the old structures of sacred law and communal tradition, were natural symbols of what was at stake. There is also the intriguing possibility that the Roman fascination with the Druids indirectly helped preserve their legend. When a conqueror writes about your spiritual class, he ensures that future generations will at least know the name, even if the tradition itself is weakened. Caesar, Tacitus, and other authors did not intend to immortalize Druidism in a romantic sense. They were documenting a hostile system of power. But history has a habit of turning hostile observations into seeds of fascination. The very fact that the Romans considered the Druids powerful enough to suppress speaks to the fact that the Druids must have been extremely influential. It is hard to imagine Rome bothering to ban a harmless backwater cult. As the Roman centuries rolled on, the world that the Druids shaped began to change at its very foundations. Cities grew according to Roman plans. Trade networks became more intensive. Local leaders Romanized. Latin seeped into the cultural fabric. The old tribal structures did not disappear entirely, but they were transformed. The spiritual class, which once acted in the roles of judge, teacher, and advisor to kings, discovered that new institutions were claiming its roles. Roman courts, Roman tax systems, Roman military obligations, and Roman civic religion, all of this changed the functioning of society. The Druids, who were the interpreters of the law and guardians of sacred legitimacy, now lived in a world where legitimacy could be granted by imperial appointment, and the law could be codified in Roman terms. Nevertheless, the ancient sacred sense of place most likely persisted. Even in Roman Britain, the land itself remained Celtic in spirit. A river that had been revered for centuries did not suddenly stop seeming sacred just because a Roman fort was built nearby. A hill that carried the memory of ancestors still towered in the imagination, even if a Roman road passed by it. The Druids could fade away as a formal institution, but the ideas they nurtured could persist in folk customs. The veneration of springs, trees, and certain landscapes survived as local tradition. The feeling that another world was close in certain places remained part of how people perceived the environment. This is why the Roman period seems more like a turn than a simple finale. The Druids found themselves caught between two colossal forces. On one side was the ancient religious and cultural system that grew organically over generations. On the other was the administrative machine of an empire that believed it could rationalize the world, making it understandable and profitable. The conflict was not only military, it was philosophical. The Druids represented a worldview in which knowledge was kept in memory, sacred authority was anchored in nature, and the law was inextricably woven with ritual. Rome represented a worldview in which power was centralized, the law codified, and religious practice increasingly tied to civic structures and, later, to imperial ideology. For an individual Druid living through these changes, this experience must have been colored by personal grief and the necessity of adaptation. Imagine a teacher whose influx of students begins to dwindle because young nobles are now captivated by Roman education. Imagine a judge whose authority is quietly undermined by the presence of Roman legal officials. Imagine a ritual leader whose sacred grove is now watched with suspicion. None of this would be dramatic within a single day. It would be the slow experience of watching your world shrink by a few inches at a time. And yet, even under suppression, there is a stubborn dignity in the very idea that Druidism could not be erased instantly. Rome was powerful, but the human attachment to the knowledge of ancestors is stronger than edicts. The Druidic presence could retreat into the shadows of local life, persisting in remote places, protected by communities unwilling to part with old orders. When later generations in Ireland and Wales remembered the Druids as sages and prophets, they were working with echoes of a tradition that had already survived centuries of pressure. When evening falls on this stretch of history, what appears before the eyes is not a battlefield, but a small gathering in a place that seems slightly hidden, a grove that escaped the worst of Roman attention, a teacher repeating sacred lore to a handful of students who still believe the old world is worth carrying into the future, a community that still lights seasonal fires, still honors the turn of the year, still treats the land as a living presence. Even if Roman buildings tower nearby, the empire may control roads and taxes, but it cannot easily control those private ways in which people interpret storms, blessings, dreams, and the quiet meaning of an oak that has stood longer than the reign of any emperor. The Roman world, for all its power, was never eternal. The Druids knew something about cycles. They lived in a universe that rotates, and although the institutions that supported them weakened under the influence of force and politics, the deep ideas of sacred time and sacred land could not be led away like prisoners. They settle in memory, folklore, and small acts of continuity that are almost invisible to conquerors. Night spreads over the countryside of Roman Britain and Gaul. Soldiers settle in their forts. Merchants count coins by the light of lamps. Local elites practice Roman manners at dinner tables. Somewhere outside official life, the old language of trees and seasons still quietly sounds. The Druids, once public architects of meanings, now occupy a narrower space, but the world they helped to shape has not disappeared. It has only learned to survive in softer voices. After Rome, the Druids do not disappear suddenly, as if at the drop of a theatrical curtain. They fade gradually just as old constellations grow faint when a bright city expands around you. You still know the stars are in place, but the sky has changed. The departure of the Romans from Britain in the early 5th century did not lead to an automatic revival of the old world. It brought uncertainty, a change of power, and a new mosaic of kingdoms trying to define their own faces. In Gaul, Roman influence persisted longer and melted into new political forms. In Ireland, which was never a formal Roman province, the old Celtic structures maintained greater continuity, but even there, the winds of change were already blowing. This is the part of history where the Druids cease to be a public institution that outsiders can easily point a finger at and begin to transform into something more complex. They become memory, rumor, local authority, and a literary shadow. They turn into figures remembered in legends, even when their original purpose has quietly changed. The force that reshaped this world deeper than any army was Christianity. It penetrated gradually through missionaries, trade networks, political alliances, and the natural human hunger for new meanings. When an old order experiences stress, it is easiest to make the mistake of imagining a clean duel between Christian saints and pagan Druids, as if history were a play with two actors and one decisive finale. In reality, everything happened much more slowly and differently in each place. Conversion does not happen overnight. It happens house by house, king by king, village by village. Sometimes it is accepted with enthusiasm, sometimes for the sake of diplomatic advantages. Sometimes it is tolerated at first and then imperceptibly becomes dominant. The Druids lived through this as a long change of cultural seasons. In previous centuries, a Druid could be the most educated person in the region, the one who resolved disputes, kept genealogies, and sanctified the ruler's legitimacy. But as the Christian clergy and monastic communities spread, they brought with them a different type of scholarly authority. Monasteries became centers of education, literacy, art, and chronicling. The Christian priest and the Druid occupied overlapping territories in the public imagination. Both could be advisors, both could interpret the mysteries of life and death, both could speak possessing an aura of sacred knowledge, and both could serve as the moral backbone of the community. When two roles overlap, history usually does not eliminate one of them instantly. It transforms the old role until it fits into the new world or until it slips into legend. Particularly in Ireland, This intersection gave rise to a fascinating transformation. The late Irish literary tradition, preserved by Christian scribes, still remembers the Druids as powerful figures of a heroic era. They appear as advisors to kings, masters of prophecies, and guardians of ritual law. The very fact of their appearance in these texts speaks to the fact that the memory of their prestige remained alive. And yet, these texts show a changing landscape. Druids in these stories sometimes seem like rivals to Christian saints, and sometimes like sages acting in a world that is already slipping away beneath their feet. A well-known motif repeated in various legends is the contest in miracles and signs. A saint comes, a druid throws him a challenge. The power of the saint turns out to be more potent. The druid's authority crumbles, or he converts to the new faith. Even if these scenes are more like literary dramatization than eyewitness testimony, they reveal something important about cultural identity. The old world was not simply rejected. It was represented in a narrative form, so that the new world could explain why it deserved victory. In this place, the story becomes both dramatic and poignant. There are hints that the learned class of the ancient Celtic world did not disappear, but rather evolved. The filled professional poets and scholars of medieval Ireland retained many functions that appeared to be the legacy of Druidic education. They preserved history, genealogy, law, and lore. They were deeply trained in poetic forms and memory. They advised kings and possessed moral authority through their word. It is highly likely that as the formal religious power of the Druids waned, a portion of this intellectual tradition was absorbed by the bardic and legal classes, which continued to exist under Christian rule. Culture is not inclined to easily abandon its respect for knowledge. It simply changes the institutions where that knowledge is housed. Even the spiritual connection to nature did not vanish. Christianity in the Celtic world developed its own locally flavored veneration for landscapes, springs, islands, and sacred sites. Many ancient wells and springs that might once have held pagan significance became associated with saints. The ancient feeling that certain places were full of power could be reinterpreted rather than erased. A sacred grove might lose its official ritual centrality, but the emotional logic of a sacred space survived in the devotion people felt for a holy well or an island monastery. In this sense, the Druidic worldview left its fingerprints on the new religious landscape. The language changed, the theology changed, but the human habit of perceiving certain places as special remained. When you consider such continuity, the classic dramatic image of St. Patrick confronting the Druids begins to seem less like a strict historical record and more like a cultural symbol. Stories of Patrick and the conversion of Irish kings often portray the Druids as established spiritual authorities who must be outshone by the new faith. There are tales of fires lit in defiance of royal or Druidic taboos, of prophetic contests, and of kings forced to choose between old and new sacred orders. Whether or not these events happen exactly as described, they show the psychological form of conversion. The new religion required a justification of legitimacy. To achieve this, it had to depict the old authority as real and strong enough to be worth defeating. This style of narrative is characteristic not only of Ireland. In Wales and Britain as a whole, the memory of ancient sacred officials persisted in the medieval imagination. The figure of the prophet, the wild seer, the man of the woods who is simultaneously cursed and blessed with knowledge, began to fill the space once more formerly occupied by the Druids. This is one reason why the later legends of Merlin seem so interesting in this context. The Welsh character Merlin, a prophet who, in some traditions, goes mad with grief and lives in the wilderness, is not literally a druid in the historical sense. However, the cultural role he plays has familiar outlines. He's a link, preserving the idea that the land still produces people capable of seeing beyond ordinary reality, people whose authority stems from communion with forces older than courts and churches. Another great shift was the rise of the written tradition. The Druids, as is known, preferred the oral transmission of sacred knowledge. Christianity, by contrast, was deeply tied to texts, scripture, commentaries, and liturgy all reinforced the authority of the written word. The growth of literacy and the culture of manuscripts gradually changed how communities stored memory. When law and history can be written down, the social need for a single class of memory keepers weakens. This does not mean that the oral tradition died, far from it, but the balance of cultural power began to shift. The Druidic ideal of secret knowledge, held in disciplined memory, was replaced by the Christian ideal that knowledge can be preserved, standardized, and disseminated through writing. For a community adapting to new realities, this must have felt both liberating and unsettling. A written record provides stability, but it also diminishes the exclusive awe of those who once guarded knowledge by voice alone. In Gaul, where Romanization had already reshaped society, the decline of the Druids likely accelerated earlier. Roman law, urbanization, and the spread of imperial religious norms narrowed the institutional space required for Druids to operate openly. By the time Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the old Druidic structures in Gaul were likely already hollowed out. What remained might have been localized forms of nature veneration and folk customs, rather than a continent-wide priestly class. The Druids in Gaul became part of the long memory of a conquered world. The history of Britain is more fractured. After the Roman departure, Britain did not instantly snap back to an old Celtic unity. The island became a mosaic of competing forces, the arrival and expansion of Germanic groups, the formation of new kingdoms, and the continued presence of Celtic-speaking populations in the West created a complex cultural picture. In such a world, the old institution of the Druids had little chance of restoring itself to its pre-Roman form. The political and demographic map had changed too much. Nevertheless, the sense of another world, the old stories of a sacred landscape, and the resilience of mythical motifs persisted in folklore, which eventually filtered into medieval literature. This is also the period when Druids began to transform from real social authorities into literary characters. Once a role is no longer relevant, it becomes available for storytelling. A Druid can become a symbol of ancient wisdom, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, or a dangerous rival to the new order. This is one reason why medieval texts sometimes portray Druids with the dramatic flair of sorcerers. Former religious authority is reinterpreted as a kind of magical opposition. The new order defines itself not only by what it is, but by what it replaces. When a scribe writes about a Druid summoning storms or uttering prophecies, the text may reflect ancient beliefs while simultaneously framing them within a moral world that has shifted. One of the most striking quiet changes of this era is the transformation of law itself. Druids were associated with arbitration and sacred legal authority. Medieval Irish society still retained complex native legal traditions often called Brehon laws, which continued to function well into Christian times. The experts of this system were not called Druids, but the very structure of scholarly legal authority, memorized rulings, and deep respect for precedent feels like an echo of an ancient educational culture. Societies do not invent complex legal memory out of nowhere, they build it over generations. The Druidic legacy may have left a trace in the way legal learning was valued and transmitted. The emotional experience of this transition must have been full of ambiguity. Imagine an elder, trained in the old ways, watching the arrival of a new faith not as a violent invader, but as a persuasive alternative. The new religion offers a universal story, a moral framework promising salvation beyond tribal boundaries, and a written tradition capable of spreading with extraordinary speed. For some, it seemed like a threat, for others, more like an expansion of the sacred world than a replacement. The human mind is capable of holding more than one system of coordinates during periods of change. It is entirely plausible that for a time, people honored the old festivals on a cultural level while adopting Christian practices spiritually, or that they accepted Christian rites while secretly preserving an ancient reverence for certain places and seasonal rhythms. This gradual blending is part of the reason why the Druids remain such an evocative presence. In later memory, They are remembered not just as a religious class, but as a symbol of an older relationship with the world, a relationship where knowledge was tied to the land, where the sacred lived in trees and rivers, and where the voice of tradition could define political legitimacy. When this worldview receded, it left behind a cultural longing. The medieval imagination could look back at the Druids and see them as representatives of a time when the land itself seemed more enchanted. And then there is the curious persistence of figures similar to Druids in local myth. Even as formal Druidic identity faded, the archetype of the wise nature seer remained useful in storytelling. The advisor who knows the ancient laws, the prophet who can interpret omens, the healer who understands the secret language of plants. These figures did not require the institutional title of Druid to exist. They could be rebranded and integrated into the narrative mechanism of a Christian society. In some tales, the old sage becomes a hermit saint. In others, he transforms into a mysterious magician of the wilderness. The functions remain recognizable even as cultural labels change. The more you look at this period, the more clearly you see that the Druids were not so much erased as redistributed into other cultural forms. The formal priesthood declined, but the intellectual respect for memory and law endured. The veneration of sacred sites evolved. The symbolic figure of the wise counselor of nature lived on in lore. This is a striking level of cultural resilience. It suggests that what the Druids embodied was not dependent solely on ritual practice. It was dependent on a deeper Celtic habit of thought, a habit that valued a world where the sacred and the practical were interwoven. With the passing of centuries, the word Druid itself became increasingly detached from living practice. By the early Middle Ages, Druids were more often remembered than encountered in person. They became inhabitants of a legendary past, but the fascination with them did not fade. On the contrary, it intensified. Because distance has a way of romanticizing what proximity might treat as routine. A living Druid might have been a stern legal authority and a demanding teacher. A remembered Druid can be a figure of mythic depth, the person who knew the secrets of the forest and the movement of the stars. At this point, the story begins to resemble a long twilight. The old world does not die from a single blow, it simply ceases to be the official daylight. The new religious and political order defines itself through different symbols. Nevertheless, beneath the surface, the old patterns continue to pulse. The seasonal logic of Celtic festivals echoes through rural life. The love for genealogy and heroic memory persists in poetry. The sacred landscape remains sacred in feeling, even when the language used to describe it becomes Christian. If you were to walk through Ireland during the early centuries of Christian expansion, you would still feel how close these two worlds were. A monastic scribe copies a gospel by candlelight, but outside the monastery walls, the land still speaks with the old voice of hills, springs, and trees. The king supports the church, but still listens with pride to poets who can recite the lineage connecting him to ancient heroes. The community gathers for a Christian feast, but the rhythm of agricultural life and communal celebration still follows the deep annual cycle, which the Druids once helped to sanctify. The old architecture of meanings did not vanish. It was renovated. There is a quiet irony in this. Christian scribes, who preserved so much of heroic Celtic literature, guaranteed that the Druids would not be forgotten. The very people representing the new order became the archivists of the old memory. They recorded stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the heroic cycles of kings, battles, and prophecies. In doing so, they preserved a cultural space where Druids could still appear as powerful figures of the past. This preservation was not always neutral. Christian authors sometimes framed old pagan elements through their own moral prism, but the very survival of these stories is a gift. Without them, the Druids would be even more ghostly than they are now. So the story of the Druids in the Christian era is not just about decline. It is about transformation. It is about how a cultural role can dissolve into a multitude of successors, about how a society can change its official faith while still maintaining an emotional loyalty to old symbols, about how the memory of a sacred class can become a mythical resource for future generations. As the day turns to evening in this part of the journey, the image that stays with me is very simple. A rural path winding between fields toward a cluster of trees, which the elders still treat with special respect. Nearby stands a new wooden cross, perhaps placed there not to erase the sacredness of the place, but to recontextualize it. Children grow up hearing both the names of saints and the old legends of heroes. The language of faith changes, but the landscape remains the same faithful witness it has always been. Somewhere in this landscape, the last of the traditional Druids might have lived out their days, not as public leaders of society, but as quiet elders whose knowledge was gradually absorbed into the memory of families and local poets. Their world was narrowing, but it was not meaningless. A culture does not forget its teachers completely. It simply learns to carry their memory differently. Certain ideas possess a strange kind of immortality. You can outlaw them. You can deprive them of institutions. You can remove the people who once carried them as a professional calling. And yet the idea remains floating in the cultural air, like pollen that refuses to settle. The Druids are a perfect example. After centuries of Roman suppression, after the long Christian transformation of the Celtic world, after the slow fading of the ancient priestly class into memory and legend, one might expect the word Druid to become merely a historical footnote. Instead, it becomes a magnet. It attracts poets, antiquarians, romantics, spiritual seekers, and the kind of enthusiastic amateur historian who looks at a standing stone and feels a personal certainty that someone important once stood right there, having a very firm opinion about the solstice. What happened to the Druids in the modern world is not simply a revival of an old religion in its pure form. It is something more, a cultural resurrection built from fragments of history, a vast amount of imagination, and a persistent human desire to believe that the ancient world left us not only ruins, but unfinished conversations. The first big wave of this renewed fascination came with the thinkers of the early modern period, and then flared up in full force during the 18th and 19th centuries. This was the era of antiquarian curiosity, when educated Europeans began to treat the distant past as something that could be reconstructed and celebrated, rather than simply dismissed as barbarism. It was also the era of Romanticism, with its special love for wild landscapes, ancient roots, and the idea that modern life had traded the soul for convenience. The Druids fit perfectly into this mood. They were associated with forests and sacred groves. In classical texts, they were linked to philosophy and cosmic knowledge, and they carried the charm of a lost elite that seemed to belong to a world more closely connected to nature on an emotional level. If you were a poet, gazing at a stormy hillside in Wales or the misty glens of Scotland, the Druids were not just historical figures for you. They were emotional proof that the land itself was once governed by a sacred mind. This is also the period when Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments were drawn into the history of the Druids in the most dramatic fashion. Today we understand that Stonehenge predates the historical Druids by a vast stretch of time. But this did not stop the scholars of the past from confidently asserting this connection. In the 18th century, figures like William Stukeley argued for Druidic links to Stonehenge. In their era, these ideas were compelling because they offered a coherent narrative. You have a mysterious monument, you have a mysterious priesthood. Join them, and you get a story that brings satisfaction, even if the real timeline is much more complicated. This belief did something important for the public imagination. It tied the Druids to physical landmarks that people could visit. Once you can stand in a circle of stones and imagine figures in robes singing in the rays of dawn, the Druids cease to be an abstraction. They become a presence you can almost feel in the air. The Romantic revival also had a slightly mischievous side, as not all who contributed to the modern image of the Druid strictly adhered to historical accuracy. In Wales, Iolo Morgan became famous for creating and promoting texts and ceremonies, passing them off as ancient. Although many of them were partially invented or heavily reworked, he helped shape the modern sense of bardic and Druidic tradition that influenced cultural festivals and national identity. What fascinates here is not the dispute over authenticity, but the cultural appetite that made these creations so influential. People wanted the Druids back. They wanted the continuity of a local wisdom that could stand proudly alongside Greek philosophers and Roman emperors. In the growing history of national cultures, the Druids were recruited as dignified ancestors, those who could give a modern nation a deep spiritual pedigree. From these romantic roots grew more formal organizations using the name of the Druids. Some of these orders were more fraternal or social than purely religious, resembling the broad tradition of societies that combined ritual, symbolism, and communal values. The Druids became part of a cultural movement that valued heritage and moral ideals, sometimes more than the exact reconstruction of Iron Age practice. This is one of the charming paradoxes of the modern history of the Druids. The more elusive the historical Druids remained, the more flexible this name became. It could serve as a banner for philosophy, for nationalism, for the veneration of nature, or for a sense of inner spiritual adventure. The Druids became a symbol large enough to contain many meanings. By the 20th century, and up to our present day, modern Druidry has developed more clearly as a spiritual path for some, often within the framework of broader modern pagan movements. Groups such as the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids helped shape a modern practice, drawing inspiration from Celtic mythology, seasonal festivals, ritual creativity, and a deep respect for the natural world. These modern traditions do not claim to be a perfect copy of the Iron Age priesthood. Instead, they often present themselves as a living spiritual art, rooted in old stories and modern needs. The holidays of the ancient Celtic year, especially Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, remain central for many who identify with Druid-inspired practice. The changing of the seasons is perceived not as a quaint historical theme, but as a sacred rhythm still worthy of reverence. In this modern landscape, the Druids also become something like ambassadors for ecological spirituality. This is no small thing. The idea of the Druid as a friend of the forests and a guardian of earthly wisdom resonates deeply with people living in an era of environmental crisis and urban alienation. Even if the historical Druids were not environmentalists in the modern political sense, the general image of a sacred relationship with the land and life offers a powerful alternative to the feeling that nature is simply a bank of resources. For many modern practitioners and admirers, Druidry is not so much the reproduction of ancient rites as the restoration of a kind of mindfulness, listening to the seasons, learning the names of trees, relating to rivers and hills as something more than just a backdrop, finding spiritual meaning in daily encounters with a living world that still seems mysteriously intelligent if only one slows down for long enough. The cultural influence of the Druids also expanded through literature, art, and ultimately, mass media. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Druid was a favorite dramatic character in novels, poems, and historical fantasies. Later, fantasy literature and role-playing games cemented the image of the Druid as a recognizable archetype, often portrayed as a image of nature, a shapeshifter, or a healer, an ally of animals and elemental forces. This version of the Druid is not an exact historical portrait, but it preserves the emotional truth of the image. The Druid belongs to the forest. The Druid knows secrets. The Druid lives in a world where nature responds to human reverence. These ideas are strong enough to survive transformation into fictional forms, because they satisfy a deep cultural hunger for enchanted landscapes and wise guardians of the world. There is also a public ritual dimension that continues to capture attention. Gatherings at sites like Stonehenge during the solstices show how modern people still crave the experience of sacred time and sacred space. You can view these events as cultural festivals, spiritual ceremonies, or theatrical declarations of identity depending on your perspective. An important point for the history of the Druids is that the name and the image still involve people in collective acts of creating meaning. A visitor might arrive a skeptic and leave quietly moved. Another might arrive already initiated and feel a connection to a chain of ancestors that is more emotional than genealogical. In any case, Druids serve as a gateway to the idea that ancient time has not died completely, that it can still be touched through ritual and imagination. What makes the modern revival of Druidry so interesting is that it is not just a story of restoration, it is a story of invention as continuity. The historical Druids left no texts of their own. Surviving accounts were written by outsiders. Medieval stories mentioning Druids were preserved through a Christian lens. Therefore, modern Druidry has had to build itself with humility and creativity, drawing from archaeology, folklore, classical sources, and a wide range of Celtic mythic materials. This is not a flaw of the tradition, it is part of its character. Modern Druidry often embraces the idea that living traditions grow, adapt, and respond to the needs of the present. In this sense, modern Druids do not claim to be museum exhibits. They claim to be participants in an ongoing relationship with nature and law. The real historical benefit of this entire revival may be broader than any single spiritual identity. Druids have helped preserve public interest in Celtic history and mythology. They have inspired people to study Iron Age Europe, to explore Irish and Welsh literature, to pay attention to cultural continuity and change, and to reflect on how societies store meaning. They have also offered people a way to touch heritage in a world where identity can seem fluid and lost. For one who feels the pull of Celtic roots, the Druids can serve as an ancestral symbol of wisdom and dignity. For one with no genealogical connection at all, the Druids can still serve as a universal reminder that humans once lived with a different sense of kinship with the earth. There is a quiet comedy in this, in a soft Bill Bryson style. The original Druids would likely be surprised to learn that their name now graces bookstore shelves, next to meditation guides, fantasy novels, and friendly manuals on how to celebrate a modern seasonal ceremony in one's backyard. They might be even more surprised to learn that their identity has been attached to monuments, built long before their time. But cultural memory is not a courtroom. It does not require flawless evidence to create a powerful story. It requires emotional utility. Druids have remained useful because they represent a type of human longing that never passes. The longing for wise teachers, the longing for a sacred landscape, the longing for a world where knowledge and nature stand in the same sentence. And, in the end, this may be the most important thread binding the ancient Druids to their modern heirs. In the imagination, both are rooted in the idea that the world is not silent, that the seasons are not just mechanistic, that a tree can be more than timber, that a river can be more than a line on a map, that wisdom can be drawn from how life behaves, and not only from what books say. In a modern world that can seem relentlessly engineered, the image of the Druid gives people permission for sincere wonder. Therefore, if you were to attend a gathering of modern Druids today in a grove, a field, or a quiet community hall decorated with symbols of the annual cycle, you would see not a perfect reconstruction of the Iron Age priesthood. You would see the afterlife of an idea. You would see how cultural memory takes the fragmentary and turns it into a living practice. You might hear poems and songs. You might see a ritual built around fire or water, and the shifting path of the sun or the promise of spring's return. You might find people who came there for spirituality, for community, for heritage, or simply for the comfort of belonging to a story larger than themselves. And you might feel that the Druids have become what many ancient figures eventually become. In the long course of history, they have become a bridge not only between the past and the present, but between the human need for meaning and the eternal presence of the natural world. The night air in this modern part of history feels different. Forests in many places have become smaller. Cities are louder. The sky at night is brighter than our ancestors could ever have deemed possible. And yet the same old human impulse remains, to gather together, to honor the turning year, to find sanctity in living beings, to imagine that the ancient world still has something to teach us if only we listen closely enough.